I've given a lot of talks in the last 10 years or 40 years for that matter, and in some ways this has got me more nervous than most of them. First off, to get rid of one problem, I've been going around like this because I have circles under my eyes, and the rumor got started last night that I had had a nose job. That is a scurrilous lie. I like my nose. I've always liked my nose. So I had a close encounter with a tree branch, which the locals call a widowmaker. This one didn't quite succeed in making my wife Ginger a widow, but it did knock me hard and drain some blood down under my eyes, which accounts for my strange appearance. Last night at our dinner, I had to yell to be heard over the din, and I don't have a strong voice, so my voice started to go away. And it reminded me of a trip. I had an invitation to speak to the Department of Atmospheric Sciences, the University of Illinois, some years ago. And on the two-hop flight going out, I realized I was getting a throat cold, which is the way I get colds. And by the time I got there, by the next morning, when I went around meeting faculty, I was very croaky. And by the time it came for me to give my talk in the late afternoon, I had no voice, absolutely zero voice. And so I cleverly told them to turn up the microphone to maximum volume, and I whispered a 50-minute lecture. And I got away with it. So I guess with that, I can give a talk with a couple of circles under my eyes with no problem at all. I'd like to thank two guys down front, Russ Bishop and Gay Mayer, who I think put me forward as a suggestion to give this talk, and to Bob and the people at Williams for following through and making it happen. I was a geology major, by my recollection, the only geology major in '64, and the reason I was the only one is that the department was in the midst of a shift from being a gentleman's C+ gut major that you would get a C+ if you were breathing. And so the old guard was kindly old Doc Perry and the renowned Freeman Foote, who I know a lot of you have memories of because he keeps getting mentioned in class write-ups. But coming along as the next generation were Jack McFadgen, a very intense, piercing glare kind of guy who was about to become chairman, and he was going to make this a hard, real science major. I took a course from Jack in tectonics. I was the only student, and for a shy guy to have to show up every day ready to answer every assignment question, knowing it was me, that was it actually got me halfway out of being a shy guy anymore. But so I took a course in tectonics, and this was just before plate tectonics exploded. This was still when Continental Drift was being debated, and he took me through a series of readings, the first half of which went to the issue that rocks, even the rocks that you can go up and bang a hammer against, so they sound hard, they ring. If you put them under high temperature and pressure, they flow. They're not hard, they're soft. And so people that were against continental drift said, how could the continents have drifted? They would have broken apart. They would have been squished and fragmented, and it couldn't happen. But also by that point, people, of course, had long since noticed that South America and Africa fit together beautifully if you reconstruct them, move them back. And by that point, the mid-ocean ridge coming down the middle of the Atlantic had been discovered, and that bisected the Atlantic perfectly, and it had the outlines of South America and of Africa. And so my final question was, what's your opinion of continental drift? And I have never enjoyed writing an answer to a test and been more challenged and more delighted and in some ways more proud of being able to grapple to two realities. That science is often about trying to figure out between two things that seem true. So I remember that course and that final fondly. Also coming up through the ranks, just beginning, was Bill Fox, who was just out of graduate school. And Bill was absolutely critical to my career in two ways. First off, because he's here somewhere back there. Because he was such a decent guy. There were no professorial airs or distance or anything. He was just a guy who taught me and I could talk to. And again, I was the only student in a paleontology class, but it wasn't as daunting as it had been with Jack McFadgen. So the first thing Bill was to me was a mentor. That's a person I could aspire to be like. And that, again, for a guy that had been shy, that was just a huge step forward for me. I could do that. And most people have a mentor somewhere along the way. That's mine right there. Another thing that he did was one day in a paleontology lab up on the second floor. I remember which direction I was facing. He brought in a vial of about like your little finger of sediments from the North Atlantic, and it had planktonic foraminifera, which are shelled plankton, which live in the surface waters and record whether the surface waters are cold or warm, and it had ice-rafted debris, which tells you that there were icebergs there. And I had one of those aha moments that I thought, that's what I want to do. And we talked about it a bit, and that's what I've been doing for 50 years. So that's two major gifts to me from Bill Fox, and I thank you. Okay, don't worry, I'm not going to run way over time here. The theme of the reunion is the times they are changing, and this serves well for the subject of this talk. This talk's going to be in two parts. One is, first part's going to be about the current global warming, anthropogenic global warming, and the planet. Is it getting warmer? If so, are we responsible? What's the future going to be like? And that's a controversial topic, and you'll probably have most of your questions for that, but I'll ask you to hold them to the end of the talk. The second part of the talk is this idea that farmers had an effect on climate long before we got into the last 150 years. So if I could see the first slide. Oh. Okay, this is to set the scene for both parts of the talk. This is 20,000 years of global climate, very cartoon simplicity. Cold in the last glaciation when there were ice sheets over our head right here. Warming up, a little bit of peak warmth 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, a little bit of cooling, and then into the industrial era, just at the end, where temperature is beginning to shoot up. It's just really begun. It hasn't shown up strongly on this scale. Now note that this covers the late Stone Age, or late Neolithic as they call it, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and then the industrial era. So the first part of the talk is going to be the industrial era. Second part of the talk is going to go back into here. So here's a record of global temperature, one of 3 or 4 such records that have been kept. They all look very much the same. It was colder in the 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. It's warmer now, and it's particularly warmer in the last 30 years, the last 15 years. Now there's some debate among climate skeptics about whether maybe we haven't plateaued off at some level in the last 15 years. If you read about this debate, you'll hear this argument again and again. But notice that all these last 15 years have a lot of red. So we're up in a different plateau. Whether or not any individual year is the warmest, the 15 years are the warmest. And you can see that if you average by decade. That's average global temperature through 2010. It warmed in the early 1900s, paused for a while, and has been warming since about 1970. So 2000 to 2010 is by far the warmest decade. It is getting warmer. Most of the heat doesn't go into the atmosphere from global warming. Most of it goes into the ocean because the ocean it mixes heat down, the sun penetrates down, and the ocean holds more than 90% of the heat coming in from global warming. And here's a plot. The units don't matter, just that's basically total heat content of the ocean. It's been getting warmer since 1960 or 70 when we first have enough data to measure the heat content of the whole ocean. And that warming trend is continuing right until now. This plot shows from 1980 to 2030 projection, thousands of cubic kilometers of sea ice. Sea ice has a large aerial extent, but it's also got an average thickness of about 5 meters. And so if you multiply the area versus the volume, versus the thickness, you get the volume. And this plot shows everything from the coldest or the most extensive, the least extensive sea ice month, which is September, up to the most extensive sea ice months, which is February, March. And you notice all months show a downward trend, and a trend that seems to be steepening in the last 10 or 15 years. Now, these curves that are shown here are projected. This is not a forecast, it's just a mathematical projection. They're projected down past the present, and you notice that the September, August sea ice extent by this plot goes to zero in the 2010s, 2020s. Even the winter sea ice extent goes to zero after that. I don't think it's going to be that rapid, but that you can judge for yourself. Do those curves describe the past behavior of the sea ice volume? If so, they're at least a possibility for the future. We are melting sea ice at the North Pole. We've already just about painted the North Pole blue. It used to be white in the summer. It's becoming blue, and we're about to start painting the colder months blue, unless something changes. Just in the last 10 years, we have satellite data sufficient to map the volume of the Greenland ice sheet, and this is billions of tons. The units won't have any meaning to you, but positive and negative will have a meaning to you. And the volume of the Greenland ice sheet is decreasing. You can get this both by measuring the gravity, which senses from space, which senses how much ice is there, because if there's less ice, it has less gravitational attraction, also by bouncing radar. And Greenland is losing ice, and you can fit a curve, reasonable-looking curve, that says it's speeding up in the amount that it's losing ice. But it's only 10 years of record, less than that shown here. But Greenland's losing ice, and the amount of ice it's losing is speeding up. Antarctica has a plot that shows about the same thing for about the same length of time. But Antarctica is an interesting case. Antarctica sits so high that you can't melt it from the top. It's always frozen at the top. The way you melt it is by getting ocean water underneath the ice shelves that come off the continent and flow out into embayments around the continent. And these ice shelves get stuck on bedrock ridges, which are called pinning points. And those pinning points slow this flow that's coming out of the interior, that's trying to draw ice out of the interior of the Antarctic ice sheet. Well, there's a study published just last month that shows that the border of the ice shelf, which is shown out here in this cartoon, is actually right over this bedrock ridge. In different embayments, it's right over the bedrock ridges. It has moved back to these bedrock ridges. And once it gets past those bedrock ridges, there's nothing to stop gravity from draining the ice from the interior of the ice sheet considerably faster. And so 2 different studies have said that the Antarctic ice sheet is beginning to go, the ice margins are beginning to go into an irreversible collapse. And collapse is a geologic term which means centuries, a couple centuries, maybe as many as 500 years or so. But these studies claim that it's already happened. We're past these, or at or past these bedrock ridges, and it's warmer. It's warm, it's still getting warmer. So we're going to melt enough ice around Antarctica by these studies. They're only out a couple of months, so you got to give science a little while to have the back and forth arguments. By these studies, there's an irreversible commitment to something like 4 meters of global sea level rise, 12 feet. You better check your beachfront property and see whether you want to leave it to your descendants or not. This is scary news, and it's not coming from alarmist scientists. It's coming from mainstream scientists, and it's been commented on by people whose expertise I trust as being scary. So a couple more indicators of the fact that we're warming the planet, that times are changing. This is the length of about 170 mountain glaciers, fairly large ones, relative to the year 1950. And you can see that they're in retreat for the last at least 150, 200 years, and in somewhat more rapid retreat perhaps in the last 50. So we're melting the mountain glaciers. They're going to pretty much all be gone by 2075. And all this ice melting, mountain glaciers, ice sheets, but not the sea ice, raises sea level, as does the warming of the ocean, which makes seawater expand. And so here's sea level for the last 100 years. And it's going up, somewhat noisy fashion, but we are raising sea level. Okay, causality. I'm just going to consider 2 factors because there's only 2 that I think are respectable. One is that the strength of the sun is changing, and the sun varies at an 11-year cycle because we know that from sunspots, but solar irradiance, or the heat coming from the radiation coming from the sun, varies with the sunspots, not in the sense that you'd expect. It's actually more heat coming to the Earth during times with more sunspots. Sounds counterintuitive, but I won't bother explaining it. So we've only had satellites to measure that since 1979. Here's this 11-year cycle in the sunspots and in solar irradiance. There is no upward trend in solar irradiance in the last 30 years. There's a clear 11-year cycle. You could even argue there's a bit of a downward trend in solar irradiance in the last 15. The sun is not the explanation for this warming. The only other possibility that I respect is variations in greenhouse gases. And here's Here's a record of 400,000 years of greenhouse gas concentrations from ice cores. And ice cores contain tiny bubbles of ancient air, and in a fantastic chemical manipulation, scientists go in, extract these air bubbles, and then measure in parts per million or parts per billion the concentration of carbon dioxide and methane. And these records actually go back 800,000 years now. Those are records from Antarctica. There's some hope of getting back to maybe 1 million or so, but that'll probably be it. You see that during previous hundreds of thousands of years, there were cycles of the ice ages from high carbon dioxide, 280 to 300, down to low values. And that's as carbon is moving around in the climate system into and out of the atmosphere, into the deep ocean. So there are natural cycles. Here's the last 15,000 years, and on this plot, you come up to the 1880s. It's about right here. It's about 280 parts per thousand, just as the industrial era begins. On this plot, we're at about 370 here. We're actually just gone past 400 parts per million this year. So we're outside the range of what nature used to do. We're into a new reality of what humans are doing. So that's the basic science, the basic causality about global warming. To me, it's a very simple story. There is an interesting situation in the country. By various surveys, 97% of the scientists who actively work on climate change, as opposed to, say, paleoclimate like me, I'm back in the past, 97% agree with the basic consensus that the climate is warming and that we are the primary cause. Only about 55% of the public think that scientists agree about this situation. They're under the impression that there are big arguments raging among scientists, whether global warming is real or not, and whether humans are responsible. That's a heck of a gap. I'm not going to go into politics. It's not my area, but I will say that, in my opinion, the main reason for this gap between what the experts know and what the public has been led to believe is energy conglomerate money, which is buying some of that 3% of scientists who have various reasons to be skeptical of global warming. They are funding their talks, their publications. So there's a misinformation campaign, and it's huge. That's something we can talk about later. Oh, just to give you one feeling about what's coming without making any specific predictions. This map shows by color, red and orange being warm, blues being cold, whether the temperature of the planet was warmer or colder than average, considerably warmer or colder than average in a given year. And the baseline for all these maps is the 1950s and 60s. So if you go back to the 50s and 60s, you get a mixture of light blues, somewhat colder, and light oranges, somewhat warmer than the average for that region for the 1950s and 60s. So it makes sense that these two maps would be just about balanced, with warmer than average, cooler than average. Here's 2010, 2011. I could have chosen any map from the last 10 years. And you notice there's still some blue, still some areas that are cooler than average. I think the East Central United States had a year like that this past year. But look at the predominance of colors. The oranges and reds are taking over, and the maroons, the ugly maroon colors, are beginning to appear. It's getting much warmer than average over larger and larger areas of the planet. And what makes it difficult to convince people that this is happening is that the exact area that is warmer or cooler, those areas move around because the planet, the climate system is complex. It's always moving heat from this area to this area. So just to pick a place at random, here's a blob of much warmer off of England and France in 1955. It's not there. 1965. You can pick your own favorite. Big warm blob here. Not much there. So it might get warmer in Texas for 2 years and then cooler 1 year. And if it's cooler for 1 year, everybody says, that climate stuff is a bunch of nonsense. It's not getting warmer. Well, you got to look at the big picture, and the big picture is it is getting warmer, and there's a heat wave that you're not going to like coming to your own location sooner or later. Okay, the second part of this talk, we're going to drop back to the last 10,000 years and look at what's happening there. And again, the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, there was a natural peak in carbon dioxide 10,000 years ago, started to come down, bottomed out, and then rose through the late Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And the same thing is true for methane, which is a greenhouse, the other major greenhouse gas. Natural peak decreased till about 5,000 years ago, and then a major increase. So my focus here is on what's this? What's this major decrease? You remember there are cycles that are natural, so we have to decide what's natural and what isn't. Here are two plots of again, methane, this time at the top, carbon dioxide at the bottom, and the red dots are what you just saw for the last 10,000 years. Peak, valley, rise, peak, valley, rise. The blue circles, the dark blue circles, are the average of previous periods like the present, periods of interglacial climate. Remember, these ice cores go through several of these glacial cycles. And for methane, there was in these previous interglacial times equivalent to 10,000 years ago, there was a natural peak and then a steady decrease. And for CO2, a natural peak and a steady decrease. So something different is going on in the last several thousand years, and it starts about 7,000 years ago for CO2, carbon dioxide, and about 5,000 years ago for methane. So that was a first hint, just as I was retiring, that something strange is going on, and it didn't take long to think that it might have something to do with humans. If downward is natural and things are going upward, that's not natural. Not natural sounds like it could be anthropogenic. Now, just at the same time this is going on, one of the major historical episodes of our species is underway, and that's agriculture, which appears and then spreads across the earth really quickly. The Fertile Crescent, Southwest Asia, you get cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs being domesticated. You get wheat and barley and peas and lentils and lots of other things being domesticated and then spreading into westward into Europe and eastward into parts of southern Asia. In China, 9,000 years ago, they're growing millet. They've also domesticated pigs. They get soybeans, and that starts to spread around parts of Asia. 5,000 years ago, you get rice domestication in south central China, and that spreads all the way through the Southeast Asian area into India as well. 5,000 years ago, the Bantu people in North Tropical Africa also domesticate various crops, and they also, people to the east, domesticate sorghum, one of the major grains. And that culture, the Bantu culture, spread south almost to South Africa, displacing the Khoisan people, Khoisan, I guess it is, the people that speak with that wonderful click. They get overrun, not necessarily from warfare, just from food and outbreeding. They get overrun by the Bantu people, one of the great migrations. I forgot to say, the people in coming into Europe, if you look at DNA and languages in Europe, there are gradients of from clear Southwest Asian affinities in DNA and in languages being very strong in Greece and in Italy and parts of the southeastern Europe, and then decreasing towards the north, where the hunter-gatherer peoples were the ones that were being displaced by the agriculturalists. In Mexico, people have come up with corn, beans, tomatoes, avocados, any number of things, and in Peru with potatoes and sweet potatoes. So those numbers, 4, 5, 9, those are thousands of years when the domestication, when the spread of the domesticates began. Here's an example of the kind of database that we have, or people have. This is all archaeology, about which I knew nothing till 10 years ago, or almost nothing. The Southwest Asian, the Fertile Crescent package, those livestock I mentioned and the crops I mentioned, are developing up till 10 or 9,000 years ago. They get into Greece by 9,000 years ago, but then after 8,000 years ago, suddenly spread all the way across Europe as far as England. And by 5,500 years ago, the Fertile Crescent crops are being grown everywhere in Europe where they're being grown today. Not as densely, but all the regions have agriculture. And what's kind of amazing is 5,500 years ago is still Stone Age. We haven't even got to the Bronze Age, and we won't for another 100 or 1,000 years. So there's a lot of data coming out of archaeology. This is an older paper, 1997. Just in the last several years, partly because of these wrong-way greenhouse gas trends that I suggested that could be anthropogenic, people have been assembling archaeological data in larger. The data are out there, so they've just been synthesizing them. You may not be able to see this easily, but this is 8,000 to 7 years ago, all the archaeological sites in China. This is the Yangtze River, this is the Yellow River. And you see most of them up around the Yellow River and not very dense. By the time you get to 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, huge density around the Yellow River area coming down into the Yangtze. That's a 30-fold increase in archaeological site density, which implies a 30-fold increase in population. That's a big explosion. All these people are farmers, and they're clearing forests as the farmers were in Europe. So if you're clearing forests, you're putting CO2 in the atmosphere, and if you're putting CO2 in the atmosphere, that's going to help explain why those trends went the wrong way, why the CO2 trend went up instead of down. Another influential study by Dorian Fuller at the University College London has mapped the spread of irrigated rice agriculture, which starts in China, but just before 5,000 years ago. And you see the map of when rice agriculture arrives in a given area. By the time you get into the last 2,000, 1,000 years, you've got rice growing everywhere it's grown today. Again, not as densely as it is today necessarily, but it's being grown. Now, rice paddies are wetlands. They're man-made wetlands, and they emit methane. You can think of stagnant water with bubbles coming up out of the water, that will be partly methane. And Dorian Fuller made an estimate. He compiled the area of rice agriculture in 1,000-year slices going back through time, and converted that to his best estimate of what the methane concentration in the atmosphere would be. More rice paddies, more methane coming out, more methane accumulating. And he came up for this interval 5,000 to 1,000 years ago with a 70 parts per billion rise in methane. That's an estimate, and it'll be revisited, but it's probably a good first order one. Here's the actual ice core record from 5,000 years ago up to 1,000 years ago. The observed increase is 100 parts per billion. So you've gone a fair way to explaining the wrong way methane trend just with rice agriculture. Now there's still some to explain, and Fuller also mapped, but he didn't try and make an estimate of methane. He mapped the spread of livestock, and the data here are a little more sparse, but you get back before 5,000 years ago, livestock are mostly in semi-arid areas, grasslands, western China's dry, the Iranian plateau area, and the Sahara, which actually was wetter then than it is now. The monsoon was running stronger. But beginning 5,000 years ago, you get livestock in well-watered, heavily populated regions, or at least better watered regions. And by 3,000 to 1,000 years ago, you've got livestock all over the place. So livestock emit methane at both ends. And so if they're proliferating, then you got more methane in the atmosphere. Right now, they're a larger source of methane than the rice paddies. So there's more work to be done, but it looks very promising to explain those greenhouse gas anomalies. I'm going to skip past that. There's one criticism that this hypothesis has had persistently, although I think it's on the verge of being met, and that is that populations several thousand years ago were too small. People just weren't using enough land. They couldn't really have put enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to affect global climate. The part of the answer to that is that the population estimates are wrong, but I'm not going to cover that today. The other part is that farming was very inefficient back in the late Stone Age. People basically went into forests with flint axes. They girdled the trees, which died, showered debris down. They set it on fire and burned it, stuck sticks into the ground, dibble sticks to plant seeds, farmed the area for 3 or 4 years. The soil played out, and they went and they burned another area. So the way you can think about this is that once they've cleared an area, farmed it for 3 years and moved on, they're now doing this somewhere else. They're not in this area anymore, but this area isn't going to recover for decades. It's not going to get its carbon back, not that kind of carbon. So it's going to have a carbon deficit relative to being a forest. So in effect, what I'm saying is people leave a footprint behind them of cleared land, which is extra CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's part of the explanation why relatively few people could do this. Okay. Stand back and look at the big picture again. Here's that cartoony climate signal that I showed you. And the part up here that's called observed trend is the trend that we can reconstruct from various climate proxies, things like tree rings and other other indices that are proxy for temperature, local temperature, and can be assembled into records of global temperature. Now, part of the hypothesis here is remember, agriculture is getting going in a small way here, but in a large way by about 8,000 to 7,000, especially 5,000 years ago. So the claim here is that this orange area, that's the effect of adding these anthropogenic, early anthropogenic agricultural greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Farming kept climate warmer, kept it up here at this observed level, but it would have gone down. It would have gotten colder. We would be heading in the direction of the next ice age, if not into the beginnings of it. And there's even a possibility that we might have passed some kind of glaciation threshold in the last several thousand years. So here's what climate did. Here's what it would have done without agriculture, according to this hypothesis. And of course, now we're into this brave new world of industrial era warming. If you take the values, the projected values that the greenhouse gas trends would have reached, the ones that I showed you several slides ago, what happened in previous interglaciations, and if you put them into a climate model designed to simulate what global climate would be like without these, either the modern industrial era greenhouse gases or the agricultural, you get something that looks like this. This is months of snow cover by one particular model. And if you've got 12 months of snow cover, which is shown in white, the snow is not melting in the summer. And if it's not melting in the summer, it's going to get added to in the next cold season and the next cold season and the next cold season. So all these areas in white are areas of incipient glaciation, embryonic glaciation. The snow is not melting even in the warmest month of the summer, and so glaciers could be growing. So that includes parts of northern Siberia, the Brooks Range, the Alaska Range, the Northern Rockies, and a big area of the Canadian archipelago. All these areas put together are larger than the size of the Greenland ice sheet. So an area larger than the Greenland ice sheet, scattered areas, there would be small but not negligible ice sheets growing. The effect in the lower middle latitudes wouldn't yet be very large, but if you're up in these areas, the effect is very large. You might have several hundred meters of ice accumulating. So this is using the greenhouse gas trends from previous interglacials, which should be natural because humans weren't a force on the land, putting them in a model and getting a prediction. So the next glaciation, according to this, the next glaciation should be underway in these regions, except had it not been for us. Last point is it's kind of a corollary to all this. These are very detailed carbon dioxide and methane trends for the last 2,000, the last 1,000 years, plotted in this case by year. And I noticed early on that there are several prominent dips in these records. And I'm figuring, well, if this trend and this trend reflects slowly rising anthropogenic greenhouse gases, then the dips must have something to do with humans as well. And I went into history, very little of which I knew on this particular issue, and found that this carbon dioxide dip correlates with times of major depopulation in Europe and the Mediterranean and in China. In China, it's usually civil strife. In Europe, it's epidemics, and in this case, culminating in a bubonic plague pandemic. Pretty good correlation. And then another dip which correlates with another of these episodes in China. This is Genghis Khan and his family ripping up Chinese infrastructure. There's the bubonic Black Death plague in Europe and the Mediterranean. And then, the big surprise to me, the biggest carbon dioxide drop and the biggest methane drop go from about 1525 into about 1700, and they correlate with the most massive pandemic that has occurred previous to industrial era times. There are now estimated to have been 50 or 60 million early American people, indigenous American people, alive in 1491, and by the time you get to 1650, there are about 10, maybe 7 million, 85% or so mortality rate. It's not mostly warfare, it's mostly that they have no immunity to all the diseases that the Europeans are carrying, and many of the diseases the Europeans are carrying have to do with the livestock that they've lived in close association with. So the Europeans have immunity. They come in and they just decimate every native population that they run into. So all these people in the Americas, almost all of them were farmers. They also did hunting and gathering, but they were farmers predominantly. So if 85% of your population dies, there's nobody to take over for you. Your farm just reverts to forest, and that pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. So I think it's pretty clear that this carbon dioxide drop has to do with regrowth of forest in the Americas. The Americas were much more deforested in 1490 than they were in 1650 or even 1700. After 1700, European populations re-deforest the Americas. In China, it has to do more with civil strife and that kind of thing. So those are the subjects, the two eras of anthropogenic global warming. The first, the modern one, which is disputed by very, very few people, scientists. And the second one, this early agricultural anthropogenic era, which is still a subject for vigorous debate. Dozens of papers published in the last several years, both sides of the argument. Science is working the way science works. Nobody has won this battle yet. My bias is that the story, with all this archaeological data, the story is shifting favorably towards this early anthropogenic view. So that's the full story of our species and anthropogenic global warming, and I would be happy to take questions. Skip Gosda. I could have predicted that Skip would have the first hand up.
I'm a great fan of Bill's first book, which was entitled Plows, Plagues, and Petroleum. And the interesting subtitle, Bill, don't get this right, help me out. How humans took control of the climate. Is that good?
Global climate.
Anyway, in that book, which is an early version of this much more developed presentation, Bill gives us a sense of history, which we unfortunately don't have these days. We live in a very human world where things are short term. You know, what's the next quarter's profits? Who's going to run in 2016? You know, I tweet somebody or something. What are you doing in the next hour? You know, it's a very short-term, man-made world. And what Bill is in is the natural world. So, Bill, just to give us a sense of some of the things that were assumed in this talk here, could you go back 400 or 800,000 years and just trace out, the number of glaciations, the periodicity of the glaciations that happened before the human influence? And while you're doing that, could you maybe explain why the carbon dioxide in these natural cycles, unaffected by humans, would decline and then increase. And could you maybe just help in that other map where the energy moves about, you know, it's warm one year in one place and the next. Why does that
I have trouble with two-part questions, and that's a three-part question. There have been something like 50 natural glacial cycles. They began about just after 3 million years ago. This is northern hemisphere. Antarctica's had an ice sheet for millions and millions of years. So ice sheets appear in North America and Scandinavia, they disappear. Those are driven by variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun, in particular how much summer sun comes in. If the summer sun comes in strong, it melts the ice. If it comes in weak, it lets it grow. And there are cycles of 20,000, 40,000, 100,000 years. So that's what you were seeing in the background of that. And I already forgot the second question.
Why does naturally the carbon decrease in these natural cycles?
There's still some discussion about that. What's clear is that the carbon that is in the atmosphere and on the land isn't there during glaciations. Part of that's simple. The ice sheets come south, they overrun or kill the trees over large parts of the northern hemisphere. That carbon has to go somewhere. It's not going into the atmosphere because the carbon dioxide levels are lower. It goes into the deep ocean. How it gets there is still a matter of discussion. Several plausible possibilities, but no final answer. And the third question.
Energy that in the map where 1 year it's going to be warm, the next year it's going to be cold. Climate people, anti-climate people say, well, it's not a trend.
I'll answer that in two parts. That's the sophisticated answer is everybody knows that the climate system is not precisely stable year by year. The phrase I like is that the climate system sloshes around. There's just a certain amount of year-to-year variability. So whether Texas is going to be in a drought next year or California, I wouldn't put any money on it. It's if you ask me, is it going to be more often in a drought 100 years from now on a decadal scale, I'd say, sure, I'll put a bet on that. Not that I'll be around to collect. Yes?
This is not on the topic of global warming, but I can't remember if Continental Drift was accepted when we were students and you were a geology major, or is that also getting resisted and fought over back?
Continental Drift, when I came through the geology department, it had been proposed. A lot of the support for it was in geologists who had actually been in the southern hemisphere, looked at the rocks in South America, looked at the rocks in Africa, and the fossils in the rocks and saw that they matched up. And so the closer you were to the field work in the area, the more you believed in continental drift. But certain, in Europe and North America, there was an attitude that it couldn't possibly exist. And well into the 50s, that attitude had to do partly with the rocks don't have the strength. They can't drift. They just fall apart if you try to move them around. It turns out they're being passively carried on a conveyor belt-like system which is operating down deep. And so they don't participate in those pushes and pulls. They just get carried from one place to another until they bump into something.
The second part of the question, about when did 97% of the geologists accept the continental drift? Was it already in the 60s? Or would it take...
I was actually, after I graduated from Williams, I was at Columbia University, which is one of the hot beds for that. I wasn't working on that at all, but so I watched it happen. I would say in about 4 years, from about 1966 to 1970, it went from something that very few people, especially in the Americas, would defend to something that very few people would oppose. But there was just this massive array of marine geophysical evidence that there were so many lines that were consistent. They're still arguing about how it happens. the driving forces, the mechanisms, has to do with heat in the Earth's interior. But there's still good arguments about that. But the fact of the matches of the continents and the patterns in the ocean that show where the continents were, they just couldn't say no to that. Although there were always a few. Russ?
You are much too modest to say that you referred to the hypothesis. I Googled before we came here to see how often the phrase the Rudderman hypothesis shows up, and it is pretty generally called that. I'm curious about what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years in terms of the number of scientists who affirm the Rudderman hypothesis as opposed to others who are against it.
It's hard for me to tell. First off, of course, I'm biased, and I only sample a certain number of people. My sense is among field scientists, archaeologists, paleoecologists, people who go out and study the last 10,000 years of what humans have been doing. It's coming fairly rapidly into acceptance, but there are certain areas of people that resist. Some geochemists resist. Some people who think that there can't possibly have been enough humans around to do that, to have that large an effect. I've had moments when I thought I might live to see it accepted. I'm not nearly as sure anymore, but I'm sure it will be, and that's good enough. Yes?
Is it possible for you to make a guess, an educated guess for sure, as to what percentage of this change has been caused by the rice paddy agriculture alone?
What percentage of the methane concentration? Of the anthropogenic fraction, I'm guessing 30 or 40%, and livestock another 30. This is today. In the past, it varies, but livestock another 40%. Burning of crop residues and weeds. You think of burning creating CO2, but it actually produces methane if the burning occurs down in a pile that the oxygen can't get into.
I'm going to stand up so you can hear my question. That was a superb lecture, and I really deeply appreciate it. I'd like you as a scientist and as a citizen to tell us where we go from here and your own take on that. I hear from time to time that we've reached points of no return if you look out 15, 20, 50 years. What is your take on that? Can we turn it around, and what is your prognosis?
Well, my first part of the answer is I don't get invited to give inspirational talks because I tend to speak too close to the truth that I perceive, and it's not inspiring. I don't have much faith that humans are going to do all that much. We have, for instance, in the U.S., individuals have done heroic things. Cities, states have done good things. The government, you know what the government's doing, except for President Obama. The government's not doing much. And down deep, I used to be an idealist. I think I've aged into a gentle cynic. And I think we're very giving up to a point, and then past that point, we're really quite selfish. And I don't think we're going to sacrifice our way back into minimal carbon emissions enough to keep a major warming from happening. My hope, though, is that technology, which is a bad word in some circles, that technology will bail us out. If somebody came up with a battery that stored 10 times as much power for 10 times as long as any existing battery, it would change things in a major way. Suddenly solar would just become a phenomenal thing. And we can be a destructive species, and we can be very creative. So here's hoping that our creativity will win out. And that's as close as I come to inspirational.
Thank you. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I just have one more quick question. Bill, should Janet and I sell our ski house now? Okay. We're going to take a 10-minute break and then come back.